Welcome to a place where time moves gently, where snow falls soft against window panes, and where the steady tick of many clocks creates a rhythm that soothes rather than hurries. Before we step into this evening together, find yourself a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already in bed, covers drawn up around you, or settled into a favorite chair with a blanket across your knees. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your jaw release. Take a slow breath in through your nose, and let it out through your mouth, longer than the breath you took in. Good. Once more. In slowly, out even more slowly. And now, let your breathing find its own natural pace. There's nothing you need to do tonight except rest. Nothing you need to remember or plan. The world can wait until morning. Tonight belongs to quietness, to gentle voices, to the soft accumulation of snow outside windows, and to the patient work of careful hands in lamplight. We are going to spend this evening, and perhaps a good portion of the night, in a narrow shop on a small street in London, in the year 1893. It is December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and the afternoon has already given way to that peculiar blue-gray dusk that settles over the city in winter. The street itself is called Clerkenwell Lane, though it's hardly a lane at all anymore, having been widened some 40 years earlier to accommodate the increasing traffic of carts and carriages. Still, the name persists, and the residents continue to use it, finding comfort in the continuity of old designations even when the physical world has shifted around them. The snow began falling shortly after 3 o'clock, tentative at first, as though uncertain of its welcome, then with increasing confidence as the temperature dropped and the sky darkened. By 4 o'clock, the cobblestones had begun to wear a thin white covering, and by 5, when most of the shops along the street started closing their shutters and dimming their lights, the snow had accumulated enough to muffle the sound of footsteps and carriage wheels, lending the evening an even deeper quietness than usual. Our watchmaker's shop sits roughly midway along the street, tucked between a bakery on one side and a stationer's on the other. The shop front is narrow, perhaps 12 feet across, with a single large window to the left of the door and a smaller window to the right. In the larger window, a modest display has been arranged. 3 clocks of varying sizes sit on a length of dark green velvet that has faded somewhat over the years but still serves its purpose. The clocks are not new, not the sort of shining merchandise meant to catch the eye of passing trade, but rather examples of work completed, timepieces that have been repaired and restored, waiting now for their owners to collect them or for new owners to claim them. The door itself is painted a deep burgundy, the color chosen many years ago by the watchmaker's father, who established the shop in 1857. A brass plate, kept polished despite the sooty air of London, bears the inscription, Nathaniel Wickham and Son, watchmakers and repairers of fine timepieces, established 1857. The son in question is our watchmaker, Thomas Wickham, who is now 51 years of age, having worked in this shop since he was 14, first as his father's apprentice, then as his partner, and finally, after his father's death 9 years ago, as the sole proprietor. Thomas stands now just inside the door, having locked it a few moments earlier, the key still in his hand. He is a man of medium height, neither stout nor particularly thin, with graying brown hair that he keeps neatly trimmed and a face that bears the marks of careful concentration rather than worry. His hands, which we will observe often this evening, are perhaps his most distinctive feature, not large, but extraordinarily steady, with long fingers that move with the precision that comes from decades of working with tiny springs and delicate gears. He wears a gray wool suit, well made but showing signs of age, and over it a canvas apron with numerous pockets, each containing small tools or parts. His spectacles, with wire frames, sit comfortably on his nose, and he adjusts them now with a habitual gesture as he turns away from the door to survey his domain. The shop interior is not large. From the door to the back wall measures perhaps 25 feet, and the width is no more than 15. But within this modest space, an entire world of timepieces resides. The walls on either side are lined with shelves, and on these shelves sit clocks of every description. Bracket clocks in wooden cases, carriage clocks with brass handles, mantel clocks with painted faces, even a few Longcase clocks that stand in the corners, too tall for the shelves, their pendulums visible through glass panels. Not all of these clocks belong to the shop. Many are here for repair, left by customers who will return for them in days or weeks. Others are pieces Thomas has acquired over the years, timepieces he intends to restore when time permits, though that time seems perpetually just beyond reach. The sound in the shop is remarkable. It is not loud, but it is constant and extraordinarily complex. Each clock ticks at its own rhythm, some fast and light, others slow and heavy, and together they create a layered symphony of mechanical sound that fills the space so completely that silence has become a stranger here. When Thomas first began working in the shop as a boy, the ticking had seemed overwhelming, a chaotic jumble that made concentration difficult. But his father had told him, with characteristic patience, that he would soon stop hearing it as noise and begin hearing it as presence, as company. And indeed, within a few months, the boy had found this to be true. Now, after nearly 4 decades, Thomas cannot imagine working without that constant, gentle percussion. On the rare occasions when he must travel away from the shop for a day or two, the silence of other places feels oppressive, almost alarming. He moves now toward the workbench that dominates the center of the room. It is a substantial piece of furniture, built by his father from oak, with a surface worn smooth by years of use. The bench is positioned to catch the best light from the windows during the day, and now, in the evening, it sits beneath a brass lamp with a green glass shade, the sort of lamp found in many workshops and studies across the city. Thomas reaches up and adjusts the lamp, increasing the brightness slightly, and the warm glow spreads across the bench's surface, illuminating the tools arranged there with careful precision. The tools themselves would mean little to most people, but to Thomas they are as familiar as his own fingers. There are tweezers of various sizes, some barely larger than a needle, others sturdy enough to grip a clock spring. There are screwdrivers with tips so small they might be used to repair a thimble, and magnifying glasses mounted on adjustable arms that can be swung into position over any part of the bench. There are tiny hammers, files no thicker than a pencil lead, brushes with bristles so fine they can clean between the teeth of the smallest gear. Containers of oil sit in a neat row, each one labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting, each containing a different formulation for different purposes. Boxes of spare parts, organized by size and type, line the back of the bench: springs, screws, hands, glass crystals, bezels, wheels, pinions. Thomas removes his coat and hangs it on a hook near the door, then returns to the bench and settles onto the tall stool that serves as his seat. The stool is old, its leather top cracked but comfortable, shaped over the years to the particular contours of its occupant. He draws a breath, letting it out slowly, and allows his shoulders to relax. The day's customers have all departed. The door is locked. The street outside grows quieter as the snow continues to fall. The evening stretches ahead, offering that particular gift that Thomas has always treasured, uninterrupted time to work at his own pace, without the interruptions of commerce, without the need to make conversation or attend to the expectations of others. On the bench before him sits a pocket watch, left this morning by a gentleman who explained, with some irritation, that the watch had begun losing time, as much as 15 minutes a day. Thomas had accepted the watch, made note of the complaint, and promised to examine it carefully. Now, with the shop closed and the evening his own, he can give the timepiece his full attention. He picks up the watch, feeling its weight in his palm. It is a good piece, made perhaps 20 years earlier, with a silver case that shows the gentle wear of regular use but no abuse. The case is engraved with initials on the back, JHM, in a flowing script. Thomas opens the case with a practiced motion, pressing the small catch and lifting the cover to reveal the face. The face is white enamel, the Roman numerals clear and well proportioned, the hands blued steel, still elegant despite 2 decades of service. He winds the watch slightly, listening to the sound of the mechanism, then holds it to his ear. The tick is there, steady enough at first listening, but as he focuses his attention, he can detect a faint irregularity, a hesitation every few seconds. It is subtle, the kind of thing most people would never notice, but to Thomas's trained ear it is as obvious as a stumble in a dancer's step. He nods to himself. The problem is not in the mainspring or the winding mechanism, but somewhere in the escapement, most likely. He sets the watch face down on a small leather pad and reaches for one of his screwdrivers. With movements so practiced they require almost no conscious thought, he removes the back of the case, revealing the movement within. The brass plates gleam in the lamplight, and the wheels and pinions, some no larger than a grain of rice, sit in their precise positions, each one contributing to the mechanism that transforms the unwinding of a spring into the measured passage of seconds, minutes, and hours. Thomas positions one of his magnifying glasses over the movement and leans in, his face close to the work. Outside, a carriage passes on the snowy street, its wheels making a soft crunching sound, but Thomas does not hear it. His attention has narrowed to the tiny world before him, to the interaction of metal upon metal, to the question of where, exactly, the irregularity originates. He can see the balance wheel oscillating, swinging back and forth with that mesmerizing regularity that is both the heart and the mystery of any timepiece. The pallet fork engages and releases the escape wheel, allowing it to advance one tooth at a time, and each engagement produces one tick. But there, yes, there it is, every so often, the pallet fork hesitates fractionally before releasing, as though something is catching. Thomas reaches for a different magnifying glass, one with higher power, and adjusts its position. Now he can see even more clearly. There is a tiny burr on one of the pallet stones, a microscopic imperfection that is causing the hesitation. It would be invisible to the naked eye, and even under moderate magnification it might be missed, but under high magnification and in the steady light of the lamp, it reveals itself. The repair, when he makes it, will take perhaps 20 minutes of concentrated work. He will need to remove the pallet fork, which means partially disassembling the movement. He will need to secure the fork in a specialized vise, then use a file so fine its teeth cannot be felt with a fingertip to smooth away the burr. Then he will need to polish the stone, reassemble the movement, and test the watch to ensure the repair has been successful. It is delicate work, requiring absolute steadiness of hand and complete attention, but it is work Thomas has done hundreds of times, and he approaches it not with anxiety but with a quiet satisfaction. Before beginning, however, he allows himself a moment simply to appreciate the watch's construction. Someone, 20 years ago, sat at a bench much like this one and assembled this movement, fitting each wheel and pinion into place, adjusting each element until the whole mechanism functioned as a unified instrument. That craftsman is unknown to Thomas. The watch bears no maker's mark beyond a serial number stamped into one of the plates, but his work remains, still performing its function, still measuring time with reasonable accuracy despite 2 decades of constant operation. There is something deeply satisfying in that continuity, in the knowledge that careful work, honestly done, can outlive its maker. Thomas sets the watch gently aside and rises from his stool. Before beginning the repair, he will tend to a few other small tasks, allowing his eyes to rest and his mind to settle even further into the particular state of calm concentration that the best work requires. He moves to the shelf where the shop's clocks reside, the ones that are wound and maintained not for customers but as part of the shop's own character. There are 7 of these clocks, each one special to Thomas for different reasons. The first is a small bracket clock made in 1785, its case of mahogany beautifully figured, its brass dial still bright. This clock was his father's favorite, and Thomas wins it now with the same key his father used, feeling the resistance of the spring as it tightens, judging by feel when enough tension has been applied. The second clock is a carriage clock, French, made in the middle of the century, with a delicate repeating mechanism that chimes the hours and quarters. The third is a Vienna regulator, its long pendulum swinging in slow, majestic arcs behind glass, its tick deeper and more resonant than the others. He moves along the shelf, winding each clock in turn, checking that each one is running properly, adjusting where necessary. This is a ritual he performs every evening before closing, and sometimes, as now, after closing as well. It is not strictly necessary. Most of these clocks will run for 8 days on a single winding, but Thomas finds comfort in the routine, in the repeated confirmation that each timepiece is functioning as it should. The snow outside continues to fall, and the window has begun to accumulate a soft margin of white along its lower edge. The street lamp nearest the shop casts a circle of yellowish light that makes the falling snow visible as it passes through, each flake briefly illuminated before vanishing back into darkness. There are fewer pedestrians now, only the occasional figure hurrying past, collar turned up, head bent against the cold. Thomas returns to his bench and settles once more onto his stool. He reaches for the pocket watch and begins the careful process of disassembly. His movements are unhurried, methodical. Each screw is removed and placed in a small ceramic dish. Each component, as it is freed from the movement, is set on the leather pad in a specific position so that reassembly will proceed smoothly. There is no rushing, no impatience. Time, after all, is what Thomas works with, and he has learned over the decades that time is most respectfully treated when one does not hurry. The balance cock comes away, revealing the balance wheel and hairspring beneath. Thomas lifts the balance assembly out with tweezers, supporting it carefully, and sets it aside. Next comes the pallet fork, the small brass piece that is the source of the problem. He secures it in a tiny vise mounted at the edge of his bench, positioning it so that the offending pallet stone is easily accessible. He selects a file from the rack, one of the finest he owns, and brings it to the pallet stone. The work now requires absolute precision. Too much pressure, too aggressive a stroke, and he will damage the stone beyond simple repair. Too little, and the burr will remain. He holds the file lightly, almost delicately, and makes a single stroke across the stone's surface. Then he pauses, examining the result under high magnification. Another stroke. Another pause. Another examination. The ticking of the shop's clocks continues around him, that constant gentle sound that measures out the minutes while he works. Somewhere in the building above, in one of the residential floors, a door closes. On the street, a dog barks once, then falls silent. These sounds register at the edge of Thomas's awareness but do not disturb his concentration. After perhaps 10 minutes of work, the burr is gone. Thomas examines the pallet stone from several angles, checking that the surface is now perfectly smooth, that no new imperfection has been introduced. Satisfied, he reaches for his polishing compound and begins the even more delicate task of restoring the stone's finish. This is work that cannot be hurried, work that requires patience and a willingness to repeat the same small motion dozens of times until the result is exactly right. Outside, the lamplighter makes his way along the street, though his work is nearly done for the evening. Thomas can see his shadow passing the window, can hear the faint scrape of his ladder against the lamppost. The lamps along Clerkenwell Lane are gas, fed from pipes beneath the street, and they require lighting each evening and extinguishing each morning. The lamplighter, a man named Porter whom Thomas has known for years, is methodical in his rounds, and his presence at this hour is as reliable as the clocks on the shelves. The polishing complete, Thomas begins the reassembly. The pallet fork goes back into its position, its arbor seated in its jeweled bearings. The balance assembly follows, the delicate hairspring coiled beside the balance will like a tiny spring of golden wire. The balance cock is replaced, its screws tightened with just the right amount of pressure, enough to secure but not enough to bind. Throughout the process, Thomas's hands move with that remarkable steadiness, each gesture precise, each placement exact. Finally, the movement is complete once more. Thomas holds the watch to his ear and listens. The tick is clean now, perfectly regular, each engagement of the pallet fork crisp and even. He smiles, a small expression of satisfaction, and sets the watch in a testing stand where it will run overnight. By morning he will be able to confirm that it is keeping accurate time, but he already knows the repair has been successful. The watch ticks with the voice it was meant to have, and that is confirmation enough. He glances at the clock on the wall, a simple round-faced piece that keeps the shop's official time. It is 6:30. The evening is still young, and there is more work to be done, but Thomas decides to pause, to rise from his stool and stretch, to walk the short distance to the back of the shop where a small stove sits in the corner, its fire banked low but still radiating gentle warmth. The stove is a luxury, installed by Thomas 5 years ago after a particularly brutal winter when the cold had made fine work almost impossible. It burns coal, and Thomas tends it carefully, adding just enough fuel to maintain a comfortable temperature without creating too much heat, which could affect the timekeeping of the clocks. Now he opens the small door and adds a few lumps of coal, watching as they settle among the glowing embers and begin, after a moment, to catch and burn. Beside the stove sits a small table, and on this table rests a kettle. Thomas fills the kettle from a pitcher of water kept nearby and sets it on the stove to heat. While he waits, he moves to the window and looks out at the snowy street. The snow has grown heavier, and the cobblestones are now completely covered, the street transformed into a smooth white expanse broken only by the occasional track of a wheel or boot. The buildings opposite, their windows mostly dark now, have their own accumulations of snow along window ledges and cornices, and the whole scene has taken on that peculiar softness that snow brings, as though the world has been wrapped in cotton wool. Thomas finds himself thinking, as he often does at this hour, about time. Not time in the abstract, not the philosophical questions that occupy professors and clergymen, but time as a practical, tangible thing, the substance he works with every day. Time, as measured by the devices on his shelves and bench, is a curious phenomenon. It is both absolutely regular and utterly subjective. The clock on the wall ticks away seconds with mechanical precision, each second identical to the one before and the one after, yet Thomas knows from experience that some hours pass in what seems like moments while others stretch endlessly. The time spent concentrating on a difficult repair seems to vanish, while the time spent waiting for a customer who is late for an appointment can feel interminable. His father used to say that watchmakers have a different relationship with time than other people. They are, in a sense, its keepers, its servants, responsible for ensuring that the rest of the world can organize itself according to time's rhythm. But they are also its observers, more aware than most of time's passage, of its accumulation, of the way it builds, second by second, into minutes, hours, days, years. The kettle begins to steam, and Thomas returns his attention to the present moment. He prepares a cup of tea, using leaves from a small tin kept on a shelf. The tea is nothing special, a simple blend purchased from the grocer 2 doors down, but it is warm and restorative, and the ritual of making it and drinking it provides a comfortable punctuation to the evening's work. He carries the cup back to his bench and settles once more onto his stool. Before returning to work, he allows himself the pleasure of simply sitting, cup in hand, listening to the clocks, watching the snow fall past the window. There is something deeply peaceful in this moment, in the solitude, in the warmth of the shop contrasted with the cold outside, in the knowledge that he is exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he was trained to do. This, Thomas thinks, is contentment. Not happiness in the sense of excitement or joy, but something quieter and perhaps more durable, the satisfaction of a life lived in accordance with one's abilities and inclinations, a life of useful work and modest comfort, a life measured out in the careful repair of small broken things. He sips his tea and lets his gaze wander across the shop, seeing it not as a place of business but as a kind of sanctuary, a space carved out from the larger world where time is not an enemy to be fought or a resource to be hoarded but simply a presence to be acknowledged and respected. The tea finished, he sets the cup aside and turns his attention to the next task waiting for him this evening. The next task presents itself in the form of a mantel clock sitting on the far corner of his workbench, a piece that has been waiting for his attention for nearly a week. It arrived in the shop last Tuesday, brought in by a woman Thomas knows by sight but not by name, one of those customers who appear once or twice a year with a clock that has stopped or a watch that has grown unreliable. She is perhaps 60 years of age, always dressed in black, a widow if Thomas's assumptions are correct, and she had carried the clock wrapped in a shawl as though it were something fragile and precious. When she placed it on the counter, she had explained, in a voice that carried the softness of someone unaccustomed to making demands, that the clock had belonged to her mother, that it had sat on the mantelpiece in her family's home for as long as she could remember, and that it had stopped running 3 weeks earlier. She had wound it faithfully, as she always did, but the hands refused to move. Could it be repaired? Was it worth the expense? She had asked these questions with a kind of anxious hopefulness, and Thomas had assured her that he would examine it carefully and do his best. Now he draws the clock toward him across the bench. It is not a particularly valuable piece, not the sort of thing that would attract a collector's interest or command a high price at auction. The case is made of oak, stained a dark brown that has aged to an almost black finish in some places. The wood shows scratches and small dents, the marks of decades spent on a busy mantelpiece, perhaps knocked by children's elbows or bumped when the mantel was cleaned. The face is painted tin, once white but now yellowed, with Roman numerals in black and a decorative design of flowers in each corner, faded but still visible. Thomas opens the back of the case, revealing the movement within. It is a simple spring-driven mechanism, the sort manufactured in quantity during the middle years of the century, reliable rather than refined, built to keep reasonable time in an ordinary household rather than to achieve the precision demanded by scientific work or navigation. He can see immediately what the problem is: the mainspring has broken, snapped near its outer end, and now hangs uselessly within its barrel. This is not an uncommon failure. Mainsprings are under constant tension, and after decades of being wound and unwound, wound and unwound, the metal fatigues and eventually breaks. The repair is straightforward in principle: remove the old spring, fit a new one, reassemble the movement, but it requires care and the right replacement part. Thomas moves to the cabinet where he keeps his stock of spare mainsprings. The cabinet is tall and narrow, with dozens of small drawers, each labeled with specifications. Width, thickness, length, arbor diameter. He pulls open several drawers, examining their contents, comparing springs to the broken one, searching for a match. After a few minutes, he finds what he needs: a spring of the correct dimensions, still coiled and secured with a small piece of wire. He returns to the bench and begins the process of removing the old spring. This is work that can be dangerous if done carelessly. A mainspring contains considerable energy even when broken, and if allowed to uncoil suddenly, it can slash fingers or send small parts flying across the room. Thomas has learned, through long experience and 1 or 2 painful lessons in his youth, to respect the power stored in these coiled lengths of steel. He secures the spring barrel in a vise and carefully opens it, using a specialized tool that allows him to control the release of tension. The broken spring comes free, and he lifts it out, examining the fracture. The break is clean, not ragged, which confirms that this was simple metal fatigue rather than a flaw in the original manufacturing. He sets the old spring aside, it will eventually be discarded, but Thomas has a habit of keeping failed parts for a time, as though they deserve a period of respect before being consigned to the scrap bin. The new spring must now be fitted into the barrel. This is delicate work, requiring the spring to be carefully coiled into the confined space of the barrel while ensuring that it is properly seated and that its inner end is secured to the arbor. Thomas has a special tool for this purpose, a winding device that allows him to control the process, and he uses it now with the patience that all such work demands. The spring resists at first, as they always do, the steel wanting to maintain its own shape rather than conform to the requirements of the barrel. But gradually, with steady pressure and careful manipulation, it yields. Thomas feeds it into the barrel, turn by turn, watching to ensure that each coil sits properly against the one before it, that no gaps or overlaps occur. The work takes perhaps 15 minutes, and when it is complete, the spring sits snugly within its housing, ready to power the clock once more. He closes the barrel and reinstalls it in the movement, then reconnects the train of wheels that will transmit the spring's energy to the hands. With the movement reassembled, he winds the clock carefully, feeling the resistance of the new spring as it tightens. When he has applied what he judges to be the correct amount of tension, he sets the hands to 12 o'clock and watches. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, with a small clicking sound, the mechanism engages. The escape wheel begins to turn, the pallet fork rocks back and forth, and the second hand, a thin brass wand, begins its journey around the face. Thomas watches it complete one full revolution, then another, listening to the clock's tick, checking that everything is functioning as it should. The tick is steady and strong, and the motion of the hands is smooth. The repair is successful. He will let the clock run for the rest of the evening and through the night, checking it periodically to ensure that it continues to perform properly, but he is confident that when the woman returns to collect it, she will find that her mother's clock has been restored to reliable service. He imagines her carrying it home, wrapped once more in the shawl, and placing it back on her mantelpiece. He imagines her winding it each week, as she has done for years, and hearing its familiar tick resume its place in the soundscape of her home. These thoughts give him satisfaction, the knowledge that his work serves not just to repair mechanisms but to preserve connections, to maintain the small continuities that help people feel anchored in time. The clock on the wall now shows 7:15. Outside, the snow continues its steady accumulation. The street is nearly deserted, only the occasional late pedestrian making his way homeward, footsteps muffled, figure hunched against the cold. The lamplighter has long since finished his rounds, and the gas lamps burn steadily, their light reflected and softened by the falling snow. Thomas rises from his stool and walks to the front window, standing close to the glass to look out. Across the street, the stationer's shop is dark, its shutters closed, its proprietor gone home to his supper. The bakery next door still shows a light in the back room, where the baker, Mr. Henshaw, will be preparing tomorrow's dough, beginning the long slow process that will result in morning loaves. Thomas knows this because he has known Mr. Henshaw for 20 years, since the baker took over the shop from his uncle, and the rhythms of the bakery have become as familiar to him as the rhythms of his own work. Sometimes, on cold evenings like this, Mr. Henshaw will knock on the door between their shops, a door that connects the two establishments through the back rooms, and will bring a meat pie or a few rolls, still warm, as a gesture of neighborliness. Thomas will make tea, and they will sit together for a while, talking of nothing in particular, simply sharing the comfort of companionship on a winter's night. But tonight there is no knock, and Thomas suspects that Mr. Henshaw is too busy with his preparations to spare the time. That is perfectly acceptable. There will be other evenings. Thomas returns to his bench, but rather than taking up another repair, he decides to attend to some organizational tasks that have been waiting for attention. There is a drawer beneath the bench that contains watch hands, hundreds of them, sorted by size and style but inevitably falling into disarray over time as he searches for particular pieces. He pulls the drawer out and sets it on the bench, then begins the methodical process of sorting through its contents, returning each hand to its proper compartment, discarding any that are bent or damaged beyond use. This is mindless work in the best sense, work that requires attention but not intense concentration, allowing his thoughts to wander while his hands remain busy. He finds himself thinking about his father, as he often does when performing tasks like this. His father had been a meticulous man, almost obsessively so, insisting that every tool be returned to its designated place, every drawer kept in perfect order, every surface cleaned at the end of each day. As a young apprentice, Thomas had sometimes chafed at these requirements, had thought them excessive and unnecessary. But as he grew older and more experienced, he came to understand that this discipline was not merely about neatness for its own sake but about creating conditions in which good work could flourish. A well-organized workshop is a peaceful workshop, his father used to say, and peace is what allows precision. The watch hand sorted, Thomas turns his attention to a similar drawer containing clock hands, larger and more varied in style. Some are simple and utilitarian, designed for servants' hall clocks or kitchen timepieces. Others are elaborate, decorated with scrollwork or shaped like ornate arrows, intended for fine parlor clocks or library pieces. He sorts through them, separating the hour hands from the minute hands, grouping them by size, occasionally pausing to admire a particularly well-made example. Time passes. The clock on the wall chimes the half hour, a single clear note that rings through the shop. Other clocks join in, some chiming, others striking, each announcing the time in its own voice. For a moment, the shop is filled with this chorus of bells and gongs, and then it subsides, leaving only the constant ticking once more. Thomas completes the sorting and slides the drawers back into their places beneath the bench. He stands and stretches, feeling the stiffness in his back that comes from sitting too long. He is not a young man anymore, and his body reminds him of this fact with increasing frequency. But the discomfort is manageable, nothing more than the ordinary aches of middle age, and he pays it little mind. He walks to the back of the shop, where a narrow door leads to a small washroom. The room contains a sink with running water, a luxury that his father had installed in the last years of his life, and Thomas uses it now to wash his hands, scrubbing away the traces of oil and metal dust that accumulate during the course of an evening's work. The water is cold, shockingly so, and he works quickly, drying his hands on a towel that hangs on a hook beside the sink. When he returns to the main room, he notices that the fire in the stove has burned down and needs attention. He adds more coal, arranging the pieces carefully, and within moments the fire revives, flames licking up around the new fuel. The warmth spreads outward, and Thomas stands near the stove for a moment, hands extended toward the heat, appreciating the comfort it provides against the winter cold that presses in from outside. His stomach reminds him that he has not eaten since midday, and he considers what to do about this. In the room above the shop, the small flat where he lives, there is bread and cheese, some cold meat, perhaps an apple. Nothing elaborate, but enough to make a simple supper. He could go up now, prepare something, and eat at the small table by the window that looks out over the street. But he finds that he is not particularly hungry, not enough to interrupt the evening's rhythm. Instead, he decides to continue working for another hour or two, and then he will go up and prepare something before bed. This decision made, he returns to the bench and considers what to work on next. There are perhaps a dozen timepieces waiting for his attention, some requiring major repairs, others needing only cleaning and adjustment. His eye falls on a small carriage clock, a French piece with a brass and glass case, brought in several days ago by a gentleman who complained that it had stopped striking the hours. Thomas had set it aside to await a time when he could give it proper attention, and now seems as good a time as any. He brings the clock to the center of the bench and opens its back panel. Carriage clocks are among his favorite pieces to work on, precisely engineered, often beautifully decorated, small enough to be portable yet sophisticated enough to include complications like striking mechanisms or alarm functions. This particular example is perhaps 40 years old, made in Paris if the marking on the movement is to be believed, and still in excellent condition apart from its current malfunction. Thomas examines the striking mechanism, a separate train of gears and levers that operates independently of the timekeeping mechanism but is triggered by it on the hour. He can see that the mechanism is intact, nothing broken or obviously damaged, which suggests that the problem is likely a matter of adjustment or cleaning rather than replacement of parts. He removes the striking train from the movement, a process that requires loosening several screws and lifting the assembly out carefully to avoid disturbing the many small parts. Once it is free, he carries it to a small tray and begins disassembling it, removing each wheel and lever, each spring and pin, laying them out in sequence so that reassembly will be straightforward. With the mechanism fully disassembled, he can see the problem. A buildup of old oil, hardened to a sticky residue, has accumulated on the pivots of one of the wheels, preventing it from turning freely. This is a common problem in older clocks that have not been regularly serviced. Oil, which is necessary for smooth operation, deteriorates over time, becoming thick and gummy, and eventually causing the very friction it was meant to eliminate. The solution is thorough cleaning. Thomas prepares a small bowl of cleaning solution, a mixture he makes himself from benzene and a small amount of detergent, and begins the careful process of cleaning each part. He uses brushes of various sizes, some no larger than a pin, to remove the accumulated residue from pivots and wool teeth. He works methodically, cleaning one part, rinsing it in clean benzene, drying it with a soft cloth, and setting it aside before moving on to the next. This work is repetitive but not tedious. There is something satisfying in watching the parts emerge clean and bright from the solution, restored to the condition they enjoyed when they were new. Thomas has always found cleaning to be meditative work, the kind that allows his mind to settle into a state of calm alertness, aware but not actively thinking, present but not preoccupied. Outside, the evening deepens toward night. The snow, which has been falling steadily for hours, shows no sign of stopping. The accumulation on the window ledge has grown to perhaps 2 inches, and the street below is now covered in a smooth white blanket broken only by a few sets of footprints and the tracks of a single carriage that passed earlier. The shop is warm now, the stove radiating heat that fills the space with a comfortable warmth. The lamps burn steadily, casting their gentle light across the workbench and the shelves. The clocks continue their eternal conversation, ticking and talking, each one keeping its own time, all of them together creating that layered sound that is the shop's constant voice. Thomas completes the cleaning of the striking mechanism and begins the process of reassembly. Each wheel is fitted back onto its arbor, each lever reconnected to its spring, each screw tightened to the proper degree. As he works, he applies fresh oil, tiny droplets placed with precision at each pivot point, just enough to lubricate without excess. Too much oil is as bad as too little, creating drag and attracting dust, and Thomas has learned over the years exactly how much is needed. With the mechanism reassembled, he tests it before reinstalling it in the clock. He moves the strike lever manually, watching as the hammers lift and fall, listening to them strike the gong. The action is smooth and positive, none of the hesitation that characterized the mechanism before cleaning. Satisfied, he reinstalls the striking train in the clock and closes the back panel. Now comes the final test. He advances the hands to just before the hour and waits. As the minute hand reaches 12, there is a small click as the striking mechanism engages, and then the hammer begins to strike the gong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 clear notes that ring through the shop, announcing the hour. The mechanism completes its cycle and falls silent, and the clock resumes its quiet ticking. Thomas smiles. Another repair completed successfully. He sets the clock aside with the others that are ready for their owners to collect and makes a note in his ledger of the work performed. The ledger is a thick book, bound in leather, its pages filled with years of similar entries, each one documenting a repair, a service, a piece of work done. It is, in its way, a record of Thomas's life, a chronicle measured not in grand events or dramatic moments but in the steady accumulation of small tasks completed with care. The clock on the wall shows 8 o'clock now, and Thomas realizes that he has been working continuously for more than an hour since finishing the mantel clock. His eyes feel tired, a familiar sensation after prolonged work under magnification, and he decides it is time for a break. He rises from his stool, extinguishes the lamp over his bench to give his eyes a rest from the bright light, and walks to the window once more. The street is beautiful in its winter transformation. The snow has softened every edge, rounded every corner, turned the ordinary scene into something almost magical. The lamplight creates pools of warmth in the whiteness, and the few windows still lit in the buildings opposite glow like small beacons. There is no one on the street now, no movement except the endless descent of snowflakes, and the silence seems almost complete, broken only by the muffled sound of the clocks behind him. Thomas stands at the window for a long time, simply watching, simply being present to the moment. There is nowhere else he needs to be, nothing else he needs to do. The evening stretches ahead, offering more time for work if he wants it, or rest if he prefers. The choice is his, and there is something deeply satisfying in that freedom, in the knowledge that his time is his own. After a while, he hears a sound from next door, a door opening and closing, and he recognizes the pattern of footsteps on the stairs that connect the bakery's back room to the street. A moment later, there is a knock on the door between the shops, the door that connects their back rooms, and Thomas turns from the window with a smile. Mr. Henshaw has found time after all. He walks through to the back room, a small space crowded with supplies and storage, and opens the connecting door. Mr. Henshaw stands there, a broad-shouldered man with flour-dusted hands and a face reddened by the heat of his ovens. He holds a basket covered with a cloth, and the smell that emanates from it is unmistakable: fresh bread. "Evening, Tom," he says, using the informal name that only old friends are permitted. "Thought you might be hungry. I've made too much, as usual, and it seems a shame to let it go to waste." Thomas accepts the basket with genuine pleasure. "You're very kind, Frank. Come in, won't you? I've just put the kettle on." This is not strictly true. The kettle is not on the stove, but it is the work of a moment to fill it and set it to heat, and Mr. Henshaw knows this, knows that the invitation is genuine despite the small fiction. He steps through the doorway, bringing with him a gust of yeasty warmth and the comfortable informality of long friendship. They make their way to the front room, and Mr. Henshaw settles into the wooden chair that Thomas keeps near the stove for visitors. Thomas busies himself with preparing tea, setting out 2 cups, finding milk in the small cool cupboard he keeps for such purposes. While the water heats, he uncovers the basket and finds, as expected, several rolls, still warm from the oven, their crusts golden brown and slightly crackly to the touch. "You've been busy today," Mr. Henshaw observes, gesturing toward the workbench with its array of tools and timepieces. "No more than usual," Thomas replies. "A few repairs, some cleaning." The work continues as it always does. "And how is business? Are people still bringing you their clocks, or have they all gone off to the modern emporiums with their fancy display windows?" Thomas smiles at this. It is a conversation they have had before, variations on the theme of old ways versus new, tradition versus innovation. "I have enough work to keep me occupied," he says. "Not as much as my father had, perhaps, but enough." People still value quality repair work, I think, even if they don't always want to pay what it's worth. The kettle begins to whistle, and Thomas prepares the tea, pouring the water over the leaves, letting it steep while he brings the cups to the small table that stands between the workbench and the stove. Mr. Henshaw has already taken one of the rolls and broken it open, steam rising from its soft interior. They sit together in companionable silence for a while, drinking tea and eating warm bread, the simple pleasures of food and warmth and friendship creating a moment of perfect contentment. Outside, the snow continues to fall, but inside the shop, all is comfortable and secure. "Do you remember," Mr. Henshaw says eventually, "that winter about 10 years ago, when the snow came on Christmas Eve and didn't stop for 3 days?" Thomas nods. "I remember. The streets were impassable. We had to tunnel our way out just to fetch coal and water." "That's right. And you fixed my kitchen clock during that time, came through the connecting door because the street was too deep to walk through. Said you needed something to occupy your hands while you waited for the snow to clear." "Did I?" Thomas has only a vague memory of this, though once reminded, details begin to return. "Yes, I suppose I did. It was a wall clock, wasn't it? With a moon phase dial. That's the one. Still keeping perfect time, by the way. I look at it every morning when I'm mixing dough, and I think of you in here, surrounded by all these ticking clocks, keeping time for the rest of us. Thomas is touched by this, though he tries not to show it. That's what we do, he says simply. Someone has to mind the time. They talk on for a while, speaking of neighborhood matters, of mutual acquaintances, of small changes and continuities. Mr. Henshaw mentions that the butcher 3 doors down is thinking of retiring, that his nephew may take over the shop. Thomas shares that he has been asked to repair a clock for the parish church, a large piece that will require scaffolding to access. Their conversation is unhurried, punctuated by comfortable silences, the kind of talk that long friendship makes possible. After perhaps half an hour, Mr. Henshaw rises to leave. I should get back, he says. The dough won't wait forever, and I've still got tomorrow's biscuits to prepare. Thomas walks him to the connecting door, and they part with the easy informality of people who know they will see each other again soon. When the door closes, Thomas is alone once more, but the shop feels warmer somehow, as though the brief visit has left something of itself behind. He returns to the front room and begins clearing away the tea things, washing the cups at the small sink, drying them and putting them away. The rolls that remain he wraps in a clean cloth and sets aside for later. The simple act of tidying gives him pleasure, restoring order, maintaining the standards of cleanliness and organization that his father instilled in him so long ago. The evening is advancing now. The clock on the wall shows 8:30, and Thomas considers how he wants to spend the remaining hours before bed. He could continue working, there is certainly no shortage of repairs waiting for attention. Or he could read for a while, there is a book upstairs, a volume on the history of English clockmaking that he has been making his way through over the past few weeks. Or he could simply sit, perhaps wind a few more of the shop's clocks, perhaps just listen to their ticking and watch the snow fall outside the window. In the end, he decides on a combination. He will work for another hour or so, completing one more repair, something not too demanding, and then he will retire upstairs, prepare a light supper, and read for a while before sleep. This plan settled in his mind, he returns to his bench, relights the lamp, and surveys the waiting timepieces. His choice falls on a lady's pendant watch, a delicate piece in a silver case engraved with floral patterns. It was brought in last week by a young woman who explained that it had belonged to her grandmother and had stopped running. She had asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether it could be repaired and what the cost might be, and Thomas had quoted her a modest price, sensing that her means were limited but that the watch held sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. He opens the case carefully, revealing the tiny movement within. It is Swiss work, beautifully finished despite its small size, with jeweled bearings and a balance wheel no larger than a small pea. The craftsmanship evident in such a piece never fails to impress Thomas. The skill required to create a functioning timepiece at this scale, where each part is barely visible to the naked eye, represents a pinnacle of human achievement in miniaturization and precision. Under high magnification, he examines the movement, searching for the cause of failure. It does not take long to find it. The hairspring, that impossibly fine spiral of steel that controls the balance wheel's oscillation, has become tangled, several of its coils press together rather than lying flat and separate. This is a problem that can occur if a watch is dropped or subjected to sudden shock, and it renders the timepiece unable to run. Repairing a tangled hairspring is one of the most delicate operations in watchmaking. The spring is so fine that it can barely be felt between the fingers, and any careless movement can damage it beyond repair. Thomas will need to remove the balance assembly from the movement, carefully separate the tangled coils, and then reinstall everything with absolute precision. He begins the work slowly, using his finest tweezers and working under the highest magnification his equipment can provide. The removal of the balance assembly goes smoothly, and soon he has the hairspring isolated, its tiny spiral visible under the magnifying glass. With a tool made from a single strand of wire, he gently teases apart the tangled coils, working with a patience that knows no hurrying, no frustration, only calm, steady progress. The work takes nearly 40 minutes, but at last the hairspring lies flat once more, each coil properly separated from its neighbors, the whole spiral perfect in its geometry. Thomas allows himself a small sigh of relief and begins the reassembly. The balance assembly goes back into its place, the bridge is secured, and he adjusts the position of the hairspring's outer end to ensure proper timing. When the movement is complete, he winds the watch and holds it to his ear. The tick is there, fast and light, the characteristic sound of a small lady's watch. He sets it running and places it carefully aside, where he will check it periodically through the night to ensure it maintains good time. The clock on the wall chimes 9, and Thomas realizes he is genuinely tired now. The day has been long, starting well before dawn as his days always do, and the comfortable warmth of the shop combined with the concentration required by his work has left him ready for rest. He rises from his stool and begins the process of preparing the shop for the night. The lamp over his bench is extinguished, leaving only the wall lamps burning. He checks each of the repairs he has completed this evening, making sure they are secure and properly positioned. He covers his bench with a cloth to protect it from dust. He tends to the stove, banking the fire so that it will burn slowly through the night, maintaining just enough heat to keep the shop from growing too cold. Finally, he walks through the shop, looking at the clocks on their shelves, listening to their various ticks and tocks, making small adjustments here and there. This is another nightly ritual, this final tour of his domain, this quiet accounting of all the small mechanisms under his care. Satisfied that all is as it should be, he moves toward the door at the back of the shop that leads to the narrow staircase and the flat above. But before going up, he pauses at the front window one last time, looking out at the transformed street. The snow has finally begun to ease. It still falls, but more gently now, the flakes smaller and less numerous. The street lies deep in white, unspoiled except for a single set of footprints, probably left by the last constable making his rounds. The scene is peaceful, beautiful in its simplicity, and Thomas stands for a long moment, simply taking it in. Then he turns away, extinguishes the wall lamps one by one, and makes his way to the stairs, leaving the shop to its clocks and its darkness, knowing that tomorrow he will return and begin again, continuing the work that has occupied him for nearly 40 years, the quiet, patient work of keeping time. The stairs that lead from the shop to the flat above are steep and narrow, built at a time when space was precious and staircases were functional rather than comfortable. Thomas climbs them slowly, one hand on the rail worn smooth by decades of use, his feet finding the center of each tread where the wood has been hollowed slightly by countless footsteps. The stairs creak in familiar places, a language he no longer consciously hears but which would alert him immediately if any sound were missing or changed. At the top of the stairs, a small landing gives way to the flat proper. It consists of 3 rooms, a sitting room that faces the street, a bedroom at the back, and a tiny kitchen tucked into what was probably once a large cupboard. The accommodations are modest, but they have been Thomas's home for more than 30 years, first when he lived here with his father, and then, after his father's death, alone. He enters the sitting room and lights the lamp that stands on a small table near the door. The flame catches and grows, pushing back the darkness, revealing the room's simple furnishings. There is a horsehair sofa, its upholstery worn but still serviceable, positioned near the window. 2 armchairs flank a small fireplace, currently unlit. A bookcase stands against one wall, its shelves filled not with novels or poetry but with technical volumes, books on horology, treatises on clockmaking, catalogues of watch parts, manuals for various mechanisms. A writing desk occupies the corner, its surface neat and orderly, a blotter in the center, a pen stand to one side, a small stack of correspondence waiting to be answered. The room is cool, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably cooler than the shop below. Thomas crosses to the fireplace and kneels before it, his joints protesting slightly at the movement. The grate holds the remnants of this morning's fire, mostly ash with a few pieces of coal that burned incompletely. He clears this away with practiced efficiency, depositing the ash in a metal bucket kept for that purpose, then builds a new fire, small but adequate for the evening's remaining hours. He has laid fires thousands of times, and his hands move through the process with automatic competence. Crumpled newspaper forms the base, then kindling arranged in a careful structure that will allow air to circulate, then several pieces of coal placed strategically on top. He strikes a match, holds it to the paper, and watches as the flame spreads. Within moments, the kindling catches, and soon the coal begins to glow, sending out the first tentative waves of heat. While the fire establishes itself, Thomas moves to the kitchen to prepare his supper. The room is barely large enough for one person to work comfortably, with a small stove against one wall, a sink with a pump handle, and a narrow counter that serves for food preparation. Shelves above the counter hold his modest collection of dishes and cooking implements. A window, smaller than those in the other rooms, looks out over a narrow alley that separates this building from the one behind it. Thomas lights the kitchen stove, a smaller version of the one in the shop below, and sets a pot of water to heat. While he waits for it to boil, he takes stock of his provisions. On the counter sits a covered dish containing the remainder of the cold meat he purchased 3 days ago from the butcher, enough for a sandwich or 2. In a tin beside it are several potatoes, and in another tin, a half loaf of bread from yesterday, still fresh enough to eat without toasting. In the cool cupboard built into the wall, he finds cheese, butter, a small jug of milk, and the apple he remembered from earlier. He decides on simplicity, bread and cheese, some of the cold meat, and a cup of tea. Perhaps the apple as well, if he finds himself still hungry after the rest. He prepares this modest meal with the same careful attention he brings to his work, slicing the bread evenly, cutting the cheese into neat portions, arranging everything on a plate in a manner that is orderly if not particularly artistic. The water boils, and he makes tea, using the same blend he prepared earlier in the shop. While it steeps, he carries his plate to the sitting room and places it on the small table that stands beside one of the armchairs. The fire has taken hold now, burning steadily, and the room has begun to warm. Thomas settles into the armchair with a small sigh of contentment, feeling the tension in his back and shoulders begin to ease. He eats slowly, without hurry, chewing thoroughly, tasting the simple flavors of bread and cheese and meat. The tea, when he sips it, is hot and slightly bitter in the way he prefers. Outside the window, the snow has stopped entirely now, and the sky has begun to clear, revealing patches of stars between the departing clouds. The street below is silent and empty, a white expanse untouched since the last footprints were laid down hours ago. As he eats, Thomas allows his mind to wander, not focusing on any particular thought but letting his consciousness drift in that pleasant state between active thinking and complete rest. He finds himself remembering, though without any deliberate intention to do so, various moments from the day just past, and then from days further back, memories rising to the surface like bubbles in still water. He remembers his father, standing at the workbench that now belongs to Thomas, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight as he bent over some delicate repair. He remembers being 14 years old, newly apprenticed, terrified of making mistakes, of disappointing this quiet, patient man who had agreed to teach him the trade. He remembers the first time his father allowed him to disassemble a watch movement entirely on his own, the mixture of excitement and anxiety he felt as he removed each tiny part, and the overwhelming relief when he managed to reassemble it successfully and the watch ran again. He remembers his mother, dead these 25 years now, who had lived in this very flat, who had cooked meals in that tiny kitchen and sewn by the window in the afternoons. She had been a small woman, quiet like his father, with hands that were always busy with some task or another. She had understood, without it ever being discussed explicitly, that both her husband and her son needed long stretches of uninterrupted concentration for their work, and she had organized the household to provide that, managing the domestic life of the flat so efficiently and unobtrusively that Thomas had not fully appreciated her contribution until years after her death, when he found himself trying to maintain the same standards alone. He remembers the shop in earlier times, when his father's reputation had filled it with customers and there had been more work than two men could comfortably manage. There had been talk, in those days, of taking on another apprentice, of expanding perhaps into the empty shop next door if it could be acquired. But nothing had come of these plans. The adjacent shop had been leased to someone else, and his father had decided that growth for its own sake was not a worthy goal, that they could manage well enough as they were. And now, of course, it is just Thomas, and the volume of work has diminished somewhat, though whether this is because his own reputation is less than his father's was, or because the world has changed and people have different attitudes toward the repair of mechanical timepieces, he cannot say. Probably both, he thinks. The world does change, whether one wishes it to or not, and one must adapt or be left behind. But he has not been left behind, not yet. There is still work, still enough to keep him occupied and to provide a modest income. And there is still satisfaction in the work itself, still that deep pleasure that comes from taking something broken and making it whole again, from understanding the intricate relationships between tiny parts and knowing exactly how to adjust them so that they perform their function perfectly. His plate is empty now, and his teacup as well. He rises and carries them to the kitchen, washes them in the small sink, dries them and puts them away. The kitchen stove has burned down, and he lets it go out. It will not be needed again until morning. Back in the sitting room, he adds another piece of coal to the fire, not because the room is cold but because he wishes the fire to last a while longer, to provide its gentle light and warmth while he sits and reads. He moves to the bookcase and selects the volume he has been reading, A History of English Clockmaking from the 16th Century to the Present. It is a scholarly work, dense with technical detail, and Thomas has been making his way through it slowly, a few pages each evening, savoring the information, sometimes pausing to consider how the techniques described compare to those he uses in his own work. He settles back into his armchair, opens the book to the place he marked with a slip of paper, and begins to read. The chapter concerns the development of the anchor escapement in the late 17th century, a crucial innovation that greatly improved the accuracy of pendulum clocks. Thomas is familiar with the basic facts. Every watchmaker learns this history as part of his training, but the book provides details he had not known before, accounts of specific clockmakers and their experiments, descriptions of the debates that surrounded the adoption of the new mechanism. He reads with full attention, occasionally pausing to consider a point more carefully, sometimes looking up from the page to stare into the fire while he thinks through the implications of what he has just read. This is how he prefers to read technical material, slowly and thoughtfully, allowing the information to settle into his understanding rather than rushing through to accumulate facts. The fire crackles softly. The clock in the sitting room, a wall-mounted piece that had belonged to his mother, ticks steadily, measuring out the minutes. From the shop below, faintly, comes the combined ticking of the many clocks there, a sound so constant that Thomas usually does not consciously hear it, but which forms a kind of background presence, a reminder that the mechanisms under his care continue their work even when he is not attending to them. After perhaps half an hour of reading, Thomas finds his attention beginning to wander. The words on the page remain clear, but his mind does not grasp them with the same focus it had earlier. This is a familiar sensation, the sign that he has reached the limit of his concentration for the day, and he does not fight it. Instead, he marks his place in the book and sets it aside on the table. He sits for a while longer, simply looking into the fire, watching the flames dance over the coal, seeing shapes and patterns that appear and dissolve without meaning or significance. This is a kind of meditation, he supposes, this quiet gazing at fire, this emptying of the mind of specific thoughts and concerns. He has done this for as long as he can remember, finding in the fire's movement a restfulness that no other sight provides. Eventually, he rouses himself and prepares for bed. He tends to the fire, spreading the coals so they will burn out safely during the night, then extinguishes the lamp. In the bedroom, a small space furnished with only a bed, a wardrobe, and a single chair, he undresses methodically, folding each garment and placing it on the chair. His nightshirt, which hangs on a hook behind the door, is flannel, warm and well-worn, soft from many washings. The sheets on the bed are cold when he first lies down, and he curls slightly, drawing his knees up, waiting for his body's heat to warm the fabric. The mattress is not new, and it has developed over the years a comfortable depression in the center where he habitually sleeps. The pillow, stuffed with feathers, shapes itself to his head. He lies in the darkness, listening. From the street comes no sound at all, the snow has muffled everything, and the city seems to have fallen into a deep sleep. From the shop below comes that faint persistent ticking, the sound that will continue all through the night, regardless of whether anyone is awake to hear it. And from within the flat itself comes the small sounds of a building settling, timbers creaking minutely as they adjust to the cold, the occasional pop from the dying fire in the sitting room. Thomas feels his body relaxing, the tension of the day draining away. His thoughts, which a few moments ago were clear and directed, begin to fragment and drift, becoming less coherent, taking on the strange logic of approaching sleep. He sees, or imagines he sees, watches and clocks, their mechanisms visible and in motion, wheels turning, springs unwinding, balance wheels oscillating with hypnotic regularity. He sees his father's hands, young and strong, manipulating tools with impossible precision. He sees the snow falling past the window, falling forever, accumulating without limit. And then he sleeps, deeply and without dreams, or at least without dreams he will remember come morning, the sleep of a man who has worked honestly and eaten simply and who lies now in a bed he has occupied for more years than he can easily count, in a building that has sheltered him for most of his adult life, in a city that continues, all around him, its vast and various existence. The night advances. The clock in the sitting room strikes 10, then 11, then midnight, each chime ringing briefly through the flat and then fading into silence. The fire dies down to embers, then to ash. The temperature drops gradually, though the flat retains enough warmth to remain comfortable. In the shop below, the clocks continue their work, ticking and talking, some of them chiming or striking the hours, all of them engaged in their essential function of measuring time's passage. Outside, clouds move across the sky, covering and revealing the moon by turns. The snow on the street remains untouched, pristine and beautiful in the moonlight. A cat, somewhere in the neighborhood, yowls once and then is silent. A constable makes his rounds, his footsteps soft in the snow, his dark lantern creating a small circle of light that moves along the building fronts and then passes on. And Thomas sleeps, peaceful and still, his breathing slow and regular, his face relaxed, free from the concentration that characterizes his waking hours. He sleeps the sleep of a man at peace with his life, neither troubled by regrets nor anxious about the future, simply resting in the present moment, allowing his body and mind the restoration they need before another day begins. The night is long, as winter nights are, but it passes as all nights do, minute by minute, hour by hour, measured by the faithful mechanisms in the shop below, which know nothing of human concerns but continue nevertheless their patient work of marking time's flow. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Thomas stirs briefly, shifting position in the bed, pulling the blankets more closely around his shoulders. But he does not truly wake, only rises for a moment to the surface of consciousness before sinking back into sleep's depths. The flat is very quiet now, and very cold, though not uncomfortably so, the cold of a winter night in a well-built building, protective rather than threatening. In the shop, one of the clocks, a large mantel-piece with a particularly resonant chime, strikes 3. The sound rises through the floorboards, faint but audible, marking the hour in the darkness. Other clocks join it, some striking, some chiming, creating for a few moments a complex overlapping chorus of bells and gongs. Then silence returns, broken only by the constant underlying tick that never ceases. Thomas sleeps on, undisturbed. The night holds him gently, and the world outside continues its slow revolution, the earth turning on its axis, carrying London and all its inhabitants through the darkness toward another dawn. The first signs of morning come slowly, almost imperceptibly. The sky, visible through the bedroom window, begins to lighten from black to deep blue to a pale gray. The stars fade, disappearing one by one as the sun approaches the horizon, still hidden but making its presence known through the gradual increase of light. Thomas wakes, as he always does, without alarm or sudden start, but gradually, moving from deep sleep to lighter sleep to drowsy wakefulness over the course of perhaps 15 minutes. He lies still at first, eyes still closed, aware of the cold air on his face, the warmth of the blankets around his body, the familiar comfort of his bed. Then, when he is fully awake, he opens his eyes and looks toward the window. The light is dim but growing stronger. He can see the shapes of buildings across the street, their outlines softened by the snow that still covers roofs and ledges. He can see that the sky is clear now, the storm having passed completely, leaving behind a transformed cityscape. He lies a moment longer, gathering himself for the day ahead, then throws back the covers and sits up, feeling the cold air immediately. His breath mists slightly in front of his face. He reaches for his dressing gown, which hangs on the bedpost, and wraps it around himself before standing. In the sitting room, the fire has gone out entirely, leaving only cold ash in the grate. Thomas does not bother to relight it, he will be going down to the shop soon, and the stove there will provide all the warmth necessary. Instead, he moves to the kitchen and begins his morning routine. The kitchen is colder than the bedroom, having no residual heat from yesterday's fire, and Thomas works quickly, wanting to generate some warmth through activity if nothing else. He fills the kettle and sets it on the stove, which he lights with the same efficiency he brings to all practical tasks. While the water heats, he washes his face in cold water at the sink, the shock of it driving away the last traces of sleep. He dresses in the bedroom, putting on clothes similar to those he wore yesterday, clean but well worn, chosen for comfort and practicality rather than fashion. Over these goes the same canvas apron he wears in the shop, its pockets already containing the small tools he habitually carries. By the time he returns to the kitchen, the kettle is boiling. He makes tea and toasts a slice of yesterday's bread over the stove's flame, holding it on a long fork, turning it carefully to achieve an even brown color. The toast, spread with butter and a small amount of jam, along with the tea, constitutes his breakfast, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while looking out the small window at the alley below. The meal completed, he washes his few dishes, dries them, and puts them away. Everything in its place, everything orderly and clean. Then he descends the stairs to the shop, his footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. The shop is cold, though not as cold as it might have been without the banked stove, which still contains a small amount of heat. Thomas attends to this first, clearing out yesterday's ashes, building a new fire, coaxing it to life with kindling and fresh coal. While the stove warms, he lights the lamps, and the shop emerges from darkness into the familiar space he knows so well. He moves to the workbench and examines the repairs he completed last evening. The pocket watch with the repaired pallet fork still ticks steadily in its testing stand. He checks it against the master clock on the wall and finds that it has gained only 3 seconds overnight, well within acceptable parameters. The carriage clock with the clean striking mechanism sits where he left it, and he advances its hands to trigger the strike. 8 clear notes ring out, perfect in their timing and tone. The lady's pendant watch with the repaired hairspring receives his particular attention. He lifts it carefully and holds it to his ear, listening to its rapid tick. Then he checks its rate against the master clock. To his satisfaction, it has kept nearly perfect time overnight, losing only a single second in approximately 9 hours. This is excellent performance for such a small movement, and he allows himself a moment of quiet pride in the work. With these checks complete, he turns his attention to preparing the shop for the day's business. He removes the cloth from his workbench, folds it neatly, and puts it away. He straightens the tools, ensuring each one is in its proper place. He dusts the counter where customers stand when they bring in their timepieces or collect repaired ones. He sweeps the floor, a quick pass with the broom to remove any debris that has accumulated. Finally, he moves to the front door and unlocks it, though he does not yet turn the sign from closed to open. It is still too early for customers. Instead, he stands in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the transformed street. The snow lies deep and undisturbed, a blanket of white that reflects the growing light of dawn. The buildings opposite are sharp-edged and clean in the cold morning air. Smoke has begun to rise from chimneys as households wake and light their fires. In the bakery next door, Thomas knows, Mr. Henshaw will already be hard at work, pulling the first loaves from his oven, the loaves whose dough he prepared last night while Thomas was completing his repairs. As if summoned by the thought, the door between the shops opens, and Mr. Henshaw appears, bringing with him the incomparable smell of fresh bread. He holds a single loaf, still hot, wrapped in a cloth. "Morning, Tom," he says cheerfully. "Thought you might like this while it's fresh." First batch of the day. Thomas accepts the gift with gratitude. "You spoil me, Frank. I shall grow fat on your generosity." Mr. Henshaw laughs. "Little chance of that, thin as you are. Besides, what are neighbors for?" He pauses, looking out at the snowy street. "Beautiful, isn't it? Makes everything look new." "It does indeed," Thomas agrees. "Though I suspect the beauty will be short-lived once the traffic begins and the snow turns to slush." "Probably right. Enjoy it while it lasts, then." And with a wave, Mr. Henshaw returns to his bakery, leaving Thomas holding the warm loaf. He carries it to his workbench and sets it down carefully, then breaks off a piece and eats it. The bread is perfect, crusty on the outside, soft and steaming within, with that incomparable flavor that fresh bread has, a taste that cannot be replicated once the bread has cooled. Thomas eats slowly, savoring each bite, washing it down with tea from the cup he has brought down from the flat. The morning advances. The light grows stronger. Along the street, other shops begin to open, their proprietors emerging to sweep their stoops, to clear away the snow from their doorways, to prepare for the day's trade. A milk cart appears, its driver bundled against the cold, his horse's breath making clouds in the frigid air. The milkman makes his stops along the street, leaving bottles at each doorway, collecting the empties left out from yesterday. Thomas finishes his bread and wipes his hands on his apron. The shop is warm now, the stove doing its work, and the lamps burn steadily, creating a welcoming glow that spills out through the window onto the snowy street. He turns the sign to open, though he knows from experience that customers rarely arrive this early. The first hour or two after opening is typically quiet, giving him time to work on repairs without interruption. He settles onto his stool and considers what to work on first. There are still several pieces waiting for attention, including a Longcase clock movement that requires complete disassembly and cleaning, a task he has been postponing because of its complexity and the time it will require. But this morning, with the shop quiet and the day stretching ahead, seems as good a time as any to begin. He rises and walks to the corner where the Longcase clocks stand. The movement in question has already been removed from its case, which stands empty, its door open, waiting for the movement to be returned. The movement itself, a substantial piece weighing perhaps 20 pounds, sits on a shelf, wrapped in cloth to protect it from dust. Thomas carries it carefully to his bench and sets it down. The movement is perhaps 80 years old, made in the late years of the previous century, constructed with the solid craftsmanship characteristic of that era. The plates are brass, thick and heavy, designed to last for generations. The wheels are cut from solid brass stock, their teeth carefully shaped and polished. Even the screws are handmade, each one slightly different from the others, filed and finished by some unknown craftsman decades ago. This movement has stopped running not because of any single catastrophic failure but because of the accumulated effect of years without proper maintenance. The oil has dried and become sticky. Dust has infiltrated the mechanism. Small amounts of wear have accumulated at the pivot points where steel arbors turn in brass plates. None of these problems, taken individually, would be enough to stop the clock, but together they have created enough friction and resistance that the weight driving the movement can no longer overcome it. The solution is complete disassembly, thorough cleaning of every part, replacement of worn pivots if necessary, fresh lubrication, and careful reassembly with proper adjustment of all clearances and depths. It is a major undertaking, the sort of work that will occupy Thomas for most of the day, possibly extending into tomorrow if complications arise. But it is also the kind of work he finds most satisfying, the complete restoration of a substantial piece, bringing it back from silence to full function. He begins by making a careful examination of the assembled movement, noting the positions of all parts, the arrangement of the wheels and pinions, the routing of the chains that connect to the weights. He makes small sketches in a notebook, crude but sufficient to jog his memory during reassembly. Then he begins the actual disassembly, removing screws, lifting off plates, separating wheels from their arbors. The work is methodical and slow, each part receiving his full attention as it is removed. Some screws are tight, requiring careful application of force to avoid stripping their slots. Some plates fit closely together and must be parted with gentle persuasion rather than force. Throughout the process, Thomas maintains absolute focus, aware that a single careless moment could damage a part that would be difficult or impossible to replace. As he works, customers begin to arrive. The bell above the door announces each one, and Thomas looks up from his work, sets down his tools, and moves to the counter to attend to their needs. The first is an elderly gentleman bringing in a pocket watch for cleaning. The second is a woman collecting a mantel clock that Thomas repaired last week. The third is a young man inquiring about the cost of having a watch's crystal replaced. Each transaction is brief, conducted with courtesy and efficiency, and then Thomas returns to his work on the Longcase movement. The process of disassembly continues, piece by piece, wheel by wheel, until the movement lies in components across his bench, organized in groups according to their function and position. Now begins the cleaning, and this is work that requires time and patience. Each part must be thoroughly cleaned to remove the old, degraded oil and the accumulated dirt. Thomas uses various brushes, various solutions, working carefully to ensure that every surface is restored to cleanliness without damaging the metal or removing the careful finish that the original maker applied. The morning passes into afternoon. More customers come and go. The sun, climbing higher in the sky, sends brilliant light reflecting off the snow, and Thomas must sometimes shade his eyes from the glare. But the work continues, steady and unhurried, the Longcase movement gradually being restored, part by part, to the condition it enjoyed when it was new. At midday, Thomas pauses to eat the remainder of the bread Mr. Henshaw brought, along with some cheese from upstairs. He makes fresh tea and stands at the window while he eats, looking out at the street where people now move more frequently, going about their daily business despite the snow. Children have appeared, some pulling sleds, others simply playing in the white drifts, their laughter carrying clearly in the cold air. After his meal, Thomas returns to work. The cleaning is nearly complete now, and he begins the process of inspecting each pivot, each bearing surface, checking for wear. Several of the arbors show signs of excessive wear at their pivots, the steel having been worn slightly oval by years of rotation in their brass bearings. These will need to be repivoted, a delicate operation that involves removing the damaged portion and fitting a new piece of steel rod, turning it down to precisely the correct diameter. This work takes Thomas into the late afternoon. The light outside begins to fade, and he lights additional lamps to maintain good illumination at his bench. The repivoting is successful, each new pivot fitting perfectly in its bearing, turning freely but without excess play. With this complete, he can begin the reassembly. This is, in some ways, the most satisfying part of the work. The movement, which has spent hours lying in pieces across his bench, begins to come together again, to regain its form and function. Thomas works with the same careful attention he brought to the disassembly, ensuring that each part is properly positioned, that each screw is tightened to the correct degree, that fresh oil is applied precisely where it is needed and in exactly the right amount. As he works, he finds himself thinking about continuity, about the way objects can outlive their makers and continue to serve their purpose across generations. This movement was created by a clockmaker who has been dead for probably 50 years or more. That craftsman cut these wheels, filed these arbors, fitted these plates together, never knowing that decades later another watchmaker would be carefully restoring his work, bringing it back to life for another generation of service. There is something profound in this, Thomas thinks. Not in a grandiose philosophical sense, but in a simple, practical way. Good work endures. Work done with care and skill creates objects that transcend their immediate purpose and become, in a sense, immortal, passing from hand to hand, generation to generation, carrying with them the skill and attention of their makers. The reassembly continues into the evening. Customers have stopped coming now, the shop door locked, the sign turned to closed. But Thomas works on, not from necessity but from the desire to see the work completed. He is close now, only a few more components to install, a few more adjustments to make. Finally, with the shop's clock striking 7, Thomas installs the last wheel, tightens the last screw, and steps back to examine the completed movement. It sits on his bench, fully assembled, clean and bright, ready to be tested. He attaches a temporary weight to the chain and gently releases the click that holds the great wheel. The weight begins to descend, pulling the chain, turning the great wheel, and the movement comes to life. The tick is strong and regular, the sound of a healthy clock. Thomas watches as the escape wheel turns, as the pallet arms rock back and forth, as all the various wheels and pinions rotate in their ancient, carefully calculated relationships. The movement runs smoothly, without hesitation or binding, exactly as it should. Thomas allows himself a smile of satisfaction. Tomorrow he will return the movement to its case, hang the weights and pendulum, and invite the customer to collect his clock. But for tonight, this is enough, the knowledge that the work has been done well, that another timepiece has been saved from silence, that the tradition of careful craftsmanship continues, one repair at a time, one day at a time, measured out in the patient ticking of clocks that will outlive us all. He stands at his bench for a long moment, listening to the newly restored movement ticking in harmony with all the other clocks in the shop, adding its voice to the chorus that fills this space day and night, marking time's passage with mechanical precision and something that almost approaches grace. The evening settles over the shop with the familiar quietness that Thomas has come to treasure. He allows the Longcase movement to continue running on his bench, wanting to observe it for a while longer before covering it for the night, listening for any irregularity in its tick, watching for any hesitation in the motion of its wheels. But the movement performs flawlessly, its restoration complete, and after perhaps 20 minutes of observation, he is satisfied. He covers the movement carefully with a clean cloth to protect it from dust, then turns his attention to the general tidying that marks the end of each working day. His tools are cleaned and returned to their designated places. The brushes used for cleaning are rinsed in solvent and hung to dry. The various containers of oil are checked to ensure their caps are tight, then returned to their shelf in strict order according to viscosity and purpose. As he works, his mind drifts to the question of what he might do with the remaining hours before bed. The restoration of the Longcase movement has occupied most of his day, leaving little time for the smaller repairs that usually fill his hours. He glances at the shelf where finished work awaits collection and notes with some satisfaction that there are now 5 pieces ready, including the pocket watch, the carriage clock, and the mantel clock from yesterday, plus the lady's pendant watch and a small traveling clock he had repaired earlier in the week. Tomorrow will likely bring some of these customers back to collect their timepieces, and with them the modest payments that keep the shop viable. Thomas has never been motivated primarily by profit. His father instilled in him early the idea that the work itself was the reward, and money merely the means by which one could continue doing the work, but neither is he naive about the practical necessities of maintaining a business. The rent must be paid, supplies must be purchased, coal must be brought in for the stove. These things require money, and money comes from completed work. Still, he has managed well enough over the years, neither growing wealthy nor falling into poverty, but maintaining that comfortable middle state where basic needs are met and small pleasures remain affordable. He has no extravagant wants, no expensive habits. His life is simple and his needs few, and this simplicity has served him well. The shop tidied, Thomas moves to the window once more. Full darkness has fallen now, and the street lamps cast their warm glow across the snow, which remains largely undisturbed despite a day of activity. Fresh snow has begun to fall again, not heavily as it did yesterday, but in a gentle, steady drift that adds to the accumulation rather than beginning anew. The flakes catch the lamplight as they fall, creating tiny sparks of brightness in the darkness. Across the street, most of the shops are closed now, their windows dark, though here and there a light shows in the upper floors where the shopkeepers live. Thomas can see Mrs. Whitmore's millinery shop, closed and shuttered, and beside it the tobacconist's, similarly dark. 3 doors down, the chemist's shop still shows a light, as it often does, the proprietor being a man who keeps late hours and can sometimes be found working at his bench well into the night, preparing powders and tinctures for his customers. The bakery next door is dark now as well. Mr. Henshaw will have finished his work for the day and gone up to his rooms, where he lives with his wife and their 2 daughters. Sometimes, in the evening, Thomas can hear the faint sounds of their family life through the wall, footsteps, voices, the occasional laugh. These sounds do not disturb him. Rather, they provide a kind of companionship, a reminder that he is not entirely alone in the world, that there are other lives being lived in close proximity to his own. Thomas finds himself thinking about solitude, about the shape his life has taken. He has lived alone for 9 years now, since his father's death, and for many years before that, since his mother passed. There had been, in his youth, the possibility of marriage, a young woman who had worked in a draper's shop several streets away, who had smiled at him when he passed, who had accepted his invitation to walk out with her on Sunday afternoons. They had walked together 6 times, talking of ordinary things, and Thomas had found her company pleasant and her manner agreeable. But nothing had come of it. Whether through his own reticence, his tendency towards solitude, or simply through circumstance, the courtship had dwindled and eventually ceased. The young woman had married someone else, a clerk in a shipping office, and Thomas had attended to his work and gradually accepted that his life would be lived alone. He had felt some regret at the time, though not acute pain, and over the years even the regret had faded, replaced by a kind of contentment with the life he had. He does not think of himself as lonely, exactly. Loneliness implies a lack, a wanting of something missing, and Thomas does not feel this want particularly strongly. He has his work, which occupies his mind and hands. He has his books, which provide companionship of a sort. He has neighbors like Mr. Henshaw, who offer friendship without demanding intimacy. And he has the clocks, whose constant ticking provides a kind of presence that, while not human, is not entirely impersonal either. Still, there are moments, usually in the evening when the day's work is done and the shop grows quiet, when he feels the weight of his solitude more acutely. Not as a burden, precisely, but as a fact that sits beside him like a silent companion. He is 51 years old, neither young nor yet truly old, but past the point where major changes in the pattern of his life seem likely. This is his life, this shop, this flat, this routine. And while it is perhaps not the life he might have imagined in his youth, it is a good life, an honest life, and he has no real cause for complaint. These thoughts, melancholy but not unhappy, drift through his mind as he stands at the window watching the snow fall. After a while, he shakes himself slightly, as though waking from a reverie, and turns back to the shop. The fire in the stove needs tending, and he attends to it now, adding fresh coal, adjusting the damper, ensuring it will burn steadily through the evening. He decides, somewhat on impulse, to do a complete winding of all the shop's clocks this evening, even though most of them were wound only yesterday and do not strictly require it. But the task appeals to him, the methodical progression from clock to clock, the physical sensation of winding each spring or raising each weight, the confirmation that each mechanism is functioning properly. It is a form of meditation, this repetitive work, a way of settling his mind and bringing his attention fully into the present moment. He begins with the bracket clock that had been his father's favorite, the small mahogany piece from 1785. The key fits snugly into the winding arbor, and he turns it slowly, feeling the resistance of the spring as it tightens, counting the turns until he reaches the point where he judges sufficient tension has been applied. The clock continues its steady tick throughout the winding, unperturbed by his intervention. Next comes the French carriage clock with its repeating mechanism. This one requires more care, as the repeating spring must be wound separately from the going spring, and each must be wound to the correct degree. Too much tension on the repeating spring can cause the mechanism to strike with excessive force, potentially damaging the gong. Too little, and the strikes will be weak and hard to hear. Thomas has wound this clock hundreds of times and knows by feel exactly the right amount of tension. He moves along the shelf, attending to each clock in turn. The Vienna regulator with its long pendulum receives its weekly winding, the weights raised slowly, hand over hand, until they reach the top of their travel. A small American shelf clock, painted with a pastoral scene, gets wound with its distinctive figure-8 motion, one spring for the time and another for the strike. A Scottish Longcase clock movement, temporarily removed from its case for case repair, is wound with a square key that Thomas keeps on a separate ring for just this purpose. The work takes perhaps half an hour, and when it is complete, Thomas stands in the center of the shop, listening. The sound of the ticking seems fuller now, richer, as though the clocks are speaking more strongly, reassured by his attention. He knows this is merely fancy, that the clocks neither know nor care whether he tends to them, that they are simply machines performing their mechanical functions. But still, he likes to imagine that they respond to care, that his attention matters to them in some small way. The clock on the wall strikes 8, and Thomas realizes he has not yet eaten a proper supper. The bread from this morning and the small piece of cheese he had at midday are not really sufficient, and his stomach reminds him of this with a faint rumbling. He considers going up to the flat to prepare something, but the shop is warm and comfortable, and he is reluctant to leave it just yet. Instead, he decides to make do with tea and whatever he can find in the small cupboard he keeps in the back room for just such occasions. He goes through to the back and searches the cupboard's contents, a tin of biscuits, somewhat stale but still edible, a small jar of honey, a wizened apple that has seen better days. And, unexpectedly, a paper bag containing 3 or 4 walnuts, probably left over from Christmas preparations last year. He brings these items to the front room and arranges them on the corner of his workbench that he has cleared for the purpose. He makes tea, strong and hot, and sits on his stool, eating slowly, cracking the walnuts with a small tool designed for watch case backs but which serves equally well for this purpose. The kernels are good, not rancid despite their age, and he eats them along with the biscuits, which he softens by dunking them in his tea. It is not a proper meal, but it is sufficient, and there is something comforting about eating here in the shop, surrounded by the ticking clocks, with the lamplight casting warm shadows and the snow falling softly outside the window. He finds himself thinking of all the other evenings he has spent here, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them over the decades, each one slightly different but all essentially the same, all marked by this same quality of quiet contentment. When he finishes eating, he clears away the remnants and washes his cup and hands at the small sink in the back room. Returning to the front, he pauses to check on the Longcase movement once more, lifting the cloth briefly to observe its continued operation. The tick remains strong and regular, and he covers it again, satisfied. He considers whether to do any more work this evening or simply to relax for the remaining hours before bed. His eyes feel tired from the day's concentration, particularly the hours spent on the detailed work of repivoting the Longcase movement's arbors. The work had required high magnification and absolute precision, and such work takes its toll on the eyes, even young eyes, and his are no longer young. He decides to give his eyes a rest and instead occupies himself with paperwork. He retrieves his ledger from the drawer where it lives and opens it to the current page, reviewing the entries for the past week. Each repair is listed with the customer's name, the type of timepiece, the nature of the problem, and the date received. As work is completed, he adds the date finished and the amount charged. When payment is received, he makes a final notation. Looking over the entries, he sees that business has been reasonably steady. Not as busy as it might have been 20 years ago, but adequate. Several of the repairs from last week have been collected and paid for. Several others await collection. And several new pieces have arrived, ensuring he will have work to occupy him for the coming days. He makes a few calculations, adding up the week's income and comparing it to his expenses. The result is modestly positive, enough to cover his needs with a small amount left over, which he will set aside in the strongbox he keeps upstairs. Over time, these small amounts accumulate into a modest reserve, providing some security against the inevitable periods when work slows or unexpected expenses arise. The ledger updated, Thomas turns to his correspondence. There are several letters that require responses. An inquiry from a customer about a clock repair that will take longer than initially estimated, a note from a supplier of watch parts confirming an order, and a brief letter from a former customer, now living in Brighton, asking if Thomas might recommend a watchmaker in that town. He takes up his pen and begins drafting responses, writing slowly and carefully in his neat, precise hand. The language he uses is formal but not stiff, courteous without being obsequious, the sort of business correspondence that his father had taught him to write and that he has been writing, with minor variations, for decades. The letter to the customer requiring the extended repair takes some thought. The clock in question has problems more extensive than were initially apparent, and a complete restoration will be needed rather than a simple repair. This will cost more and take longer, and Thomas must explain this in a way that is honest but not alarming, that justifies the additional expense without making it seem he is simply inflating the price. He writes a draft, considers it, crosses out several lines and rewrites them, considers again, and finally produces a version that satisfies him. The letter explains the problems discovered, describes the work that will be needed, provides an estimate of the time and cost involved, and offers the customer the option of proceeding with the full restoration or simply having the clock returned as it is. The tone is respectful but confident, the tone of a craftsman who knows his work and can explain it clearly to those who are not specialists. The other letters are more straightforward and are completed quickly. Thomas will post them tomorrow when he goes out for his midday walk, a routine he maintains regardless of weather, believing that fresh air and movement are necessary for both physical and mental health. With the correspondence completed, Thomas finds himself at loose ends. It is not yet 9 o'clock, too early for bed by his usual habits, but he has exhausted his planned activities for the evening. He sits at his bench, listening to the clocks, watching the snow fall outside the window, feeling the pleasant weariness that comes from a day of satisfying work. His gaze falls on a small shelf near the window where he keeps several objects that are not timepieces but which he values nonetheless. There is a magnifying glass that had belonged to his father, much older and less powerful than the ones Thomas uses for his work but kept for sentimental reasons. There is a small brass box containing a set of Watchmaker's screwdrivers that his mother had given him when he completed his apprenticeship, commissioned specially from a tool maker and engraved with his initials. There is a photograph in a simple frame, taken perhaps 15 years ago, showing his father standing in front of the shop, his expression serious but with a hint of pride in his eyes. Thomas takes down the photograph and looks at it for a long moment. His father had been 63 when this picture was taken, already past the age Thomas is now, already showing the signs of the illness that would take him 5 years later. But in the photograph he stands straight, his shoulders squared, his hands clasped in front of him, the very image of a respectable tradesman, proud of his work and his place in the world. Thomas remembers the day the photograph was taken. A photographer had been making his way along the street, offering to take portraits of shopkeepers for a modest fee, and his father had agreed, more to please Thomas than out of any vanity of his own. They had arranged the shop carefully before the picture was taken, ensuring that the most impressive clocks were visible in the window, that the brass plate on the door was freshly polished, that everything looked prosperous and well-maintained. After the photograph was taken and the prints delivered, his father had seemed almost embarrassed by it, dismissing it as foolishness and vanity. But Thomas had noticed that he would occasionally pause in front of where it hung, studying it with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been something more complex, something involving both pride and mortality, the awareness that this image would outlast the man it depicted. And indeed it has. His father has been gone these 9 years, but the photograph remains, and when Thomas looks at it, his father is there again, standing in front of the shop that he built, embodying the values of craftsmanship and integrity that he tried to pass on to his son. Thomas hopes he has been successful in maintaining those values, in carrying on the work in a manner that would have pleased his father. He returns the photograph to its place and turns his attention back to the shop. The evening is advancing, and the temperature has dropped noticeably. Despite the stove's efforts, the shop is no longer comfortably warm but merely tolerable, and Thomas knows from experience that it will grow colder still as the night progresses. He adds more coal to the fire, building it up for the night, then begins the process of preparing to close the shop and retire upstairs. But before doing so, he decides to engage in one final ritual, one that he performs only occasionally but which he finds meaningful when he does. He goes to the cabinet where he keeps his most precious tools and equipment, items that are too valuable or too delicate for everyday use. From this cabinet he removes a pocket watch that has never been offered for sale and never will be. His father's watch, the one his father carried every day of his adult life until illness made the winding of it too difficult a task. Thomas has maintained this watch with meticulous care since his father's death, winding it weekly, cleaning it annually, ensuring that it continues to function perfectly despite no longer serving any practical purpose. It is not a particularly valuable piece in monetary terms, a decent English lever watch made in the middle of the century, but it is priceless to Thomas as a connection to his father. He winds the watch now, feeling the familiar resistance of its mainspring, hearing the solid click as the ratchet engages. The watch face shows 8:30, and Thomas sets the hands to match the master clock on the wall. The second hand begins its sweep around the dial, marking time with the same steady rhythm it has maintained for nearly 50 years. Thomas holds the watch for a moment, feeling its weight in his palm, warm from his hand. Then he opens the back case and reads, as he has read hundreds of times before, the inscription engraved on the inner surface, to Nathaniel Wickham, from his grateful father, on the occasion of his marriage, June 15, 1842. His grandfather had given this watch to his father on his wedding day. His father had carried it through decades of work and life. And now Thomas keeps it running, maintaining the connection across generations, honoring the continuity of family and craft. Someday, presumably, the watch will pass to someone else, though Thomas has no children and no close relatives. Perhaps it will go to a museum, or to another watchmaker who will appreciate its history, or perhaps it will simply be sold with the rest of his estate when he dies. But for now, it is his responsibility, and he tends to it with the same care he brings to all his work. He returns the watch to its place in the cabinet and locks the door. The evening's rituals are complete. It is time to bank the fire, extinguish the lamps, and retire upstairs to the flat where another fire waits to be lit, another book waits to be read, and eventually, sleep waits to claim him once more. But before he does any of this, he allows himself one last moment at the window, looking out at the snowy street, at the quiet city beyond, at the world that continues its existence independent of his observation. The snow falls steadily, accumulating without hurry, transforming the familiar into something strange and beautiful. The lamps burn, marking human presence in the darkness. And in the shop behind him, the clocks tick on, measuring time with mechanical precision, caring nothing for snow or darkness or human concerns, simply continuing their eternal work of marking the passage of moments into hours into days. Thomas takes a deep breath, feeling the cold air entering his lungs, then releasing it slowly. Another day is ending. Another day will follow. The work continues, as it has continued and will continue, a small thread in the vast tapestry of human activity, modest but essential, anonymous but meaningful. He is content with this, content with his place in the order of things, content with the quiet rhythms of his life. He turns from the window and begins the nightly routine of closing the shop, moving through the familiar steps with practiced ease, preparing for rest and for the work that tomorrow will inevitably bring. The process of closing the shop has become so habitual over the years that Thomas's hands seem to move of their own accord, requiring little conscious direction. He begins by checking each of the clocks one final time, a quick visual survey to ensure that all are running properly, that no pendulum has stopped, that no striking mechanism has jammed. Everything is as it should be, the constant ticking filling the shop with its reassuring presence. He moves to the workbench and covers it completely with the heavy cloth kept for this purpose, protecting the tools and works in progress from the dust that inevitably settles during the night despite the shop's closed door and windows. The Longcase movement, still running beneath its lighter covering, he leaves as it is, wanting it to continue its test run through the night. The lamps are extinguished one by one, each wick trimmed before being blown out, each glass shade wiped clean of soot. Thomas's father had been insistent about the proper maintenance of lamps, had taught him that neglecting these small tasks led to larger problems over time, that the discipline of daily attention to details was what separated the competent craftsman from the merely adequate one. Thomas has carried this lesson with him for nearly 40 years, and he attends to his lamps now with the same care his father would have expected. The stove receives its final tending. Thomas opens the door and examines the fire, judging how much coal to add, how much to adjust the damper. He wants the fire to burn slowly through the night, maintaining enough heat to prevent the shop from becoming dangerously cold, but not so much heat that coal is wasted. It is a calculation he makes every night, adjusting for the outside temperature, the wind, the particular characteristics of the coal he is using. Tonight, with the temperature well below freezing and the wind picking up, he adds slightly more coal than usual and closes the damper partway. With the shop properly secured, Thomas makes his way to the back room and through to the narrow staircase. He pauses at the bottom, his hand on the rail, and looks back at the darkened shop. Only the faint glow from the stove's vents provides any light, barely enough to make out the shapes of the workbench and shelves. But he can hear the clocks clearly, their combined ticking creating that complex rhythm that has been the soundtrack to his entire adult life. He climbs the stairs slowly, feeling the day's work in his legs and back. The stairs are unlit, but he knows their geography so completely that he could navigate them blindfolded. His feet find each tread automatically, avoiding the loose board fourth from the top, catching himself slightly on the next to last step where the riser is slightly higher than the others. The flat, when he enters it, is cold and dark. He lights a candle to see by, then moves immediately to the sitting room fireplace to build a fire. The grate is still full of this morning's cold ash, and he clears it quickly, his movements efficient despite the chill that makes his fingers stiff. Fresh paper, kindling, coal, the fire takes shape and then takes light, and within a few minutes warmth begins to spread through the room. While the fire establishes itself, Thomas lights the oil lamp on the small table, then goes to the bedroom to change from his work clothes into something more comfortable for the evening. He removes his apron first, hanging it on its hook behind the door where it will be ready for tomorrow. His waistcoat and shirt follow, replaced by older, softer garments that have been washed and worn until they feel like a second skin. Over these he puts on a thick wool cardigan that his mother had knitted for him years ago, its elbows patched but its warmth undiminished. Returning to the sitting room, he finds the fire has taken hold and the room has begun to lose its chill. He settles into his usual chair, the one position to catch both the fire's warmth and the lamplight for reading, and allows himself simply to sit for a few moments, enjoying the transition from work to rest, from the public space of the shop to the private space of his home. His thoughts drift without direction or purpose. He thinks about the Longcase movement, wondering if it will maintain its rate through the night or if further adjustment will be needed tomorrow. He thinks about Mr. Henshaw next door, probably sitting down to dinner with his family at this very moment. He thinks about the snow, which continues to fall, and whether it will be possible to make his usual midday walk tomorrow if the accumulation becomes too deep. After a while, his stomach reminds him that the biscuits and walnuts he consumed earlier were not sufficient sustenance for a full day's work. He rises and goes to the kitchen, where he considers his options for a proper supper. The cold meat is nearly gone, but there is still enough for a modest sandwich. He has eggs, which he could boil or fry. There is soup, tinned, which he could heat. In the end, he decides on simplicity, soup and bread, with an apple for dessert if he is still hungry afterward. He puts a pot on the stove and opens the tin of soup, a vegetable soup that he purchases from the grocer in quantities of half a dozen tins at a time. The soup is nothing remarkable, but it is hot and filling and requires minimal effort to prepare. While it heats, he slices bread, the end of the loaf that Mr. Henshaw brought yesterday, and butters it generously. The soup ready, he carries it to the sitting room and eats in his chair by the fire, the bowl balanced on his lap, the bread on a small plate beside him. The food is warm and comforting, if not particularly interesting, and he eats methodically, his mind still drifting in that pleasant state between thought and rest. When he finishes, he returns the bowl and plate to the kitchen, washes them along with the pot, and puts everything away. The kitchen tidy once more, he returns to the sitting room and stands before his bookcase, considering what to read this evening. The book on clockmaking history that he has been working through still beckons, but he finds himself not quite in the mood for technical reading tonight. Instead, his eye falls on a volume of essays by Charles Lamb, a book he has read before but which rewards revisiting. He takes down the volume and settles back into his chair. The fire crackles softly. The lamp casts a steady circle of light. Outside, the wind has picked up, and he can hear it testing the windows, finding the small gaps around the frames and whistling through them softly. The sound is not unpleasant, rather the opposite, making the warmth and shelter of the flat feel all the more secure by contrast. He opens the book to the first essay and begins to read. Lamb's prose is discursive and gentle, moving from observation to reflection to memory without hurry or rigid structure, exactly the sort of writing Thomas finds most congenial in the evening. The essay concerns itself with the pleasure of reading old books, a subject that resonates with Thomas, who finds in well-worn volumes a kind of companionship that new books, for all their pristine beauty, cannot quite provide. He reads slowly, occasionally pausing to gaze into the fire or to consider a particular phrase or thought more carefully. There is no hurry, no pressure to finish. The essay will be there tomorrow if he does not complete it tonight. The book itself will remain on his shelf, a constant presence, ready to be taken down whenever its particular voice is what he needs to hear. After perhaps half an hour, he realizes that his attention is beginning to wander, the words on the page requiring more effort to comprehend than they did when he began. This is the signal that his mind is ready for sleep, that he has reached the natural end of his waking day. He marks his place in the book and sets it aside on the table. Before preparing for bed, he goes to the window and looks out one last time at the street below. The snow has accumulated significantly, perhaps 4 or 5 inches now, and it continues to fall steadily. The street is completely deserted, not even the occasional late walker passing by. The lamps burn in their circles of light, islands of visibility in the darkness. Across the way, most windows are dark now, the neighborhood settled for the night. Thomas wonders, as he sometimes does at moments like this, about all the other lives being lived in the buildings he can see, in the streets beyond, in the vast sprawling city that surrounds this small pocket of Clerkenwell. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, each with their own concerns and routines, their own work and rest, their own small dramas and quiet contentments. The thought is both overwhelming and oddly comforting, this sense of being one small part of an immense whole. He turns from the window and tends to the fire one last time, adding a final piece of coal and adjusting the screen to guard against stray sparks. The lamp he extinguishes, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the sitting room. Then he makes his way to the bedroom, taking with him a candle to light his way. The bedroom is cold, as it always is on winter nights, and he changes quickly into his nightshirt, not wanting to prolong his exposure to the chill air. His clothes he folds and places on the chair, a habit so ingrained that he performs it even in the dark, even when exhausted, maintaining the order his father taught him so long ago. The bed, when he slides beneath the covers, is initially cold, the sheets feeling almost damp with the chill, but he knows from experience that this will pass quickly as his body heat warms the space around him. He lies on his back, staring up at the ceiling that he cannot quite see in the darkness, listening to the wind outside and the faint, persistent ticking from the shop below. His mind, which has been active all day with problems to solve and tasks to complete, begins to slow and quiet. Random thoughts drift through, a customer's face, a particular clock movement, the snow falling past the window, but none of them catch hold, none demand his attention. They pass through like clouds across a night sky, present and then gone. He thinks briefly of his father again, as he often does before sleep, remembering some particular moment or conversation. Tonight what comes to mind is something his father said near the end, when illness had confined him to his bed and he knew he would not recover. They had been talking about the shop, about Thomas's ability to carry on alone, and his father had said, with characteristic practicality, the work will continue. That's what matters. Not the individual craftsman, but the work itself, passing from hand to hand, generation to generation. At the time, Thomas had found these words almost unbearably sad, a resignation to mortality that he was not ready to accept. But now, years later, he understands them differently. His father had not been expressing despair but rather a kind of peace, an acceptance that one's individual existence is less important than the continuity of purpose and craft, that meaning lies not in personal immortality but in contributing to something larger and more enduring than oneself. Thomas has become that continuation. He maintains the shop his father established. He practices the skills his father taught him. He upholds the standards his father insisted upon. And when his own time comes, the work will pass to someone else, or it will end, and either way the world will continue, and that is as it should be. These thoughts, rather than troubling him, bring a kind of comfort. He is doing what he was trained to do, living as he was taught to live, maintaining standards and traditions that he believes are worth maintaining. The life is modest, anonymous, unremarkable by the standards of those who measure success by wealth or fame or influence. But it is an honest life, a useful life, and that is enough. His breathing has slowed and deepened. His body has relaxed into the mattress. The cold of the sheets has been replaced by comfortable warmth. From somewhere in the building, perhaps the flat above or the rooms at the back, comes the muffled sound of a door closing. Then silence returns, broken only by the wind and the distant ticking. Thomas's thoughts become more fragmented, losing their coherence, blending into the beginning of dreams. Images arise unbidden, clock movements that transform into architectural structures, streets made of watch springs, snow falling upward. These strange visions do not disturb him. They are simply the mind's way of transitioning from waking consciousness to sleep, the border country between two states of being. And then, without marking the exact moment of transition, he is asleep. The night advances through its watches. The fire in the sitting room burns down gradually, its light fading from bright flame to glowing coals to dim embers. The temperature in the flat drops slowly as the heat dissipates. Outside, the snow continues its steady accumulation, building up on window ledges and roof slates, weighing down the branches of the few trees that grow in the small yards behind the buildings. In the shop below, the clocks continue their work, ticking through the hours, some of them chiming or striking at intervals, announcing the passage of time to the empty room. The Longcase movement on the workbench maintains its steady rhythm, its test run proceeding successfully through the darkness. The fire in the stove burns low but does not go out, maintaining just enough heat to keep the mechanisms from being damaged by extreme cold. The city around the shop is mostly quiet now, though not entirely silent. A constable makes his rounds, his steps muffled by the snow, his lantern creating a moving circle of light as he checks doors and investigates any suspicious sounds. A cat, perhaps the same one that yowled earlier, prowls through an alley, searching for mice or rats. In the distance, a church bell strikes the hour, 12 strokes, marking midnight, the transition from one day to the next. Thomas sleeps through all of this, deeply and peacefully, his breathing slow and regular, his face relaxed. His sleep is not entirely dreamless, fragments of images and sensations drift through his consciousness, too fleeting and insubstantial to be called proper dreams, but present nonetheless. But it is restful, restorative, the sleep of a body and mind that have worked hard and can now release themselves into rest without anxiety or resistance. The hours pass. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. The snow begins to slacken, the flakes becoming smaller and more widely spaced. The wind, which had been gusting strongly, calms to a steady breeze, then to an occasional puff. The clouds begin to break up, revealing patches of clear sky where stars shine with winter brightness, their light sharp and cold. At some point in the deep middle of the night, Thomas stirs briefly, shifting position in the bed, pulling the blankets more securely around himself. But he does not wake. His mind remains submerged in sleep, and after a moment he settles again, still and quiet. The clock in the sitting room, one of those that strikes the hours, announces 3 o'clock with 3 clear chimes that ring through the flat. The sound does not disturb Thomas. He has lived with striking clocks for so long that his sleeping mind no longer registers them as requiring attention, though he would wake immediately if any clock struck at the wrong time or with the wrong tone, some deep part of his consciousness remaining always alert to his charges. 3:30. 4 o'clock. The night is at its deepest now, the hour when sleep is most profound, when the body's temperature drops to its lowest point, when the world seems to hold its breath before the gradual approach of dawn. In the flat, in the shop, in the building and the street and the city beyond, a great stillness prevails, not complete silence but something close to it, a pause in the ceaseless activity of human life. And Thomas sleeps on, undisturbed and unaware, his rest peaceful and complete, his dreams, such as they are, gentle and untroubling, as the night slowly turns toward morning and another day approaches, bringing with it the continuation of work and routine, the endless, patient ticking of clocks that measure time but are themselves beyond time, existing in an eternal present that knows neither past nor future, only the constant, steady now of mechanism and motion. The darkness begins, almost imperceptibly, to lessen. Not with any dramatic change, not with the sudden arrival of light, but with a gradual, nearly invisible shift from absolute blackness to something fractionally less absolute. The process is so slow that no observer could mark its progress from moment to moment, but over the course of half an hour, then an hour, the difference becomes undeniable. The darkness is retreating. Dawn approaches. Thomas begins to wake as he always does, not suddenly but gradually, rising slowly through layers of sleep like a swimmer ascending from depth toward the surface. First comes a dim awareness of physical sensation, the weight of blankets, the pressure of the pillow against his cheek, the slight stiffness in his shoulder from lying in one position too long. Then comes awareness of sound, the wind, much quieter now than it was last night, and beneath it the persistent ticking from the shop below. His eyes open, but there is little to see in the darkness of the bedroom. He lies still for a moment, oriented himself, confirming through that mysterious internal sense that all people possess that it is indeed morning, or near enough to morning to justify rising. His body feels rested, his mind clear. The night has done its work of restoration. He sits up slowly, feeling the cold air on his face and hands, the parts of him that were exposed while he slept. The bedroom is notably colder than it was when he went to bed, the fire in the sitting room having burned out hours ago. He reaches for his dressing gown, wrapping it around himself before his feet touch the cold floor. In the sitting room, the fireplace contains only ash, gray and lifeless. Thomas goes immediately to rebuild it, working by the faint light that comes through the window from the street lamps that still burn outside, supplemented by the even fainter light of approaching dawn. His hands know the work so well that he hardly needs to see what he is doing. Paper, kindling, coal, match. The flame catches, spreads, grows. Within moments, warmth begins to radiate outward. While the fire establishes itself, Thomas moves to the window and looks out at the street. The snow has stopped completely now, leaving behind a transformation. The street lies under perhaps 6 inches of fresh white snow, unspoiled except for a single set of footprints, likely from the constable's early morning rounds. The buildings opposite wear caps of snow on their roofs and window ledges. The scene is beautiful in its simplicity, peaceful in a way that the ordinary street, for all its familiarity, seldom achieves. The sky is lightening in the east, a band of pale gray expanding upward from the horizon, pushing back the darkness. It will be another hour before true sunrise, but the day has begun its approach, and Thomas can feel in himself the corresponding movement from rest toward activity, from inward contemplation toward outward engagement with the world and its demands. He turns from the window and makes his way to the kitchen, where he begins the process of preparing for the day. Water for tea, bread for toast, the simple rituals of morning that anchor the transition from sleep to waking life. And as he works, moving through these familiar motions, he finds himself grateful once again for the life he has, modest though it may be, a roof overhead, a fire to warm him, work that engages his mind and hands, and the steady, faithful ticking of clocks that will continue long after he himself has joined his father in that undiscovered country from which no traveler returns. But that is for another day, perhaps many days hence. This day, this new day that even now approaches with the dawn, this day belongs to work in continuity, to the patient maintenance of small, precise mechanisms, to the quiet satisfaction of craft practiced honestly and well. Thomas makes his tea and begins another day. Thank you for journeying with me through this long, quiet winter's evening in a London watchmaker's shop. I hope these gentle hours have helped ease you toward rest, or kept you company through your own quiet night. If you found peace in these ticking clocks and softly falling snow, I invite you to subscribe to Mystic Sleep Tales, where more restful stories await you. Please leave a comment sharing where you're listening from. I love knowing our little community stretches across the world. Sleep softly, dear listener, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the snow settling on Clerkenwell Lane.